Welcome to the session on policy pilots and the path to personalized learning. My name is Jim Shelton. I'm currently the president of the Zuckerberg Initiative's education work. I'm going to talk for a few minutes, but this is really about you hearing from folks at the local, the state, and the national level about how work towards personalized learning is progressing, what some of the policy implications are, and most importantly, what some of the things are that seem to be getting in the way. Before we start that conversation, though, I just want to remind us for a second a little bit about why. And so I want to just ask a quick question. How many of you have heard of a guy named Benjamin Bloom? Raise your hand. Awesome. Okay, for the other folks, you guys indulge me for a second. There was this guy who in the late 70s and early 80s asked a question you would think someone asked a long time ago in education, which is, if you gave every kid highly favorable conditions, what could they do? And his proxy for figuring this out was, what if I gave every kid a safe environment and an expert tutor? That's a pretty favorable condition. And then he ran controlled studies, taking those kids with those individual tutors and comparing their performance to kids in traditional classrooms. And what he found was that, again and again, that average student, that 50th percentile student, with a one-to-one tutor would outperform 98% of kids in a traditional classroom. Now, once you hear those results and see the evidence, then pretty quickly you have to come to the conclusion it is really never about the kids, but whether or not we create the kind of experiences and environments that allow kids to succeed. Now, here's the challenge for us, right? That set of experiments became famously known as Bloom's 2 sigma problem. That 2 sigma, 2 standard deviations being the difference between the 50th percentile and 98th percentile. Why the problem? Where do you get all the people, and where do you get all the money? Now, that is a policy question if there ever was. Like, if we know we can actually produce these outcomes for almost all of our kids, and the only thing between us and that is figuring out how we actually afford the ability to do that at scale for each one of them, then that is a bounded problem that we then need to be about the business of solving. It has policy implications, it has practice implications, it has R&D implications, but it puts us in the position of knowing that if we are not doing that for our children, then that's our fault. So I just want to put that front and center so we're very clear about what we're working towards here when we talk about moving towards personalized learning. It is our ability to produce over and over again for every single child the kind of experiences and environments that allow them to perform at those levels. The second reason is that we're going to need those levels of performance from our kids, and they're going to need them through their lives. You have already heard the conversations about the changing environment and the future of work, and the implications of that for being able to, for the half-lives of the jobs and the skills that our kids are going to go into, getting shorter and shorter over time. What that means is they're going to have to much more quickly know how they learn, know how to seek out a new learning objective, and develop a competence to do something completely different than they were doing before. Like, that is going to be how you survive. And our ability to build systems that support them to do that over and over again throughout their lives is also going to be our job. The third thing is we got big problems to solve. And it's going to take a lot of diverse minds to help figure out how to solve them. And so when we create these conditions, we can actually do that. Now, the part of my background I didn't talk about is that I was also Deputy Secretary of Education. And I have to tell you that one of the reasons I'm really fascinated about this panel is because one of the things that happened to me most that I was constantly surprised about was that people would call me who I knew in the field and say, I really need your help. There's this policy that is getting in the way of me doing what I want to do, and I need you to help me get it out of the way. And I go, great, tell me what it is. And then I go down to my folks and I start asking questions, and they go, they can do that. I go, really? Yeah, matter of fact, they've always been able to do that. Now, there are definitely policy barriers that are in the way, but there's also a lot more freedom than people are aware of and are not taking advantage of. So what I want us to hear today is the fact and the fiction about what those things are, what people are finding out when they're trying to get this work done in schools is getting in the way, is not getting in the way, and what's getting in the way that ought not be getting in the way. And then we can have a conversation where you get to ask questions. Now, I'll point out at the beginning, there are going to be 2 mics up here for questions. I'm going to try and let you have as many opportunities to ask questions as possible. And with that, let me begin to introduce my co-panelists as soon as I get my service to open back up. So Tony Townsend is going to come up first so we can actually hear from the school perspective from someone who's tried to do this work. Tony is the principal of Locust Grove Middle School in Georgia. One of the things that we should be talking about a lot is what are the different entry points that people are going to use to begin to think hard about how you approach personalized learning. Tony used blended learning as a jumping off point, is my understanding, and we'll talk about the path that he took to get there and some of the things that got in the way. And with that, I'll just let him do his thing.
Thank you. Am I on here? Good morning. First of all, thank you, Mr. Shelton, for the opportunity, and certainly the people here at ExcelinEd for putting this conference together. The keynote this morning was fantastic and energizing. Really excited to see what the conference holds coming up here in the next couple of days. Also, just want to say thank you to Angela real quick for holding it down for the people that don't have hair on the panel, because evidently the guys are struggling. So thank you. But good morning. My name is Tony Townsend. I am just one change to that. I am now the principal of Locust Grove High School. I was for the last 8 years the principal of Locust Grove Middle School. Those are 2 schools in Henry County, and yes, they are feeder schools of one another. I like to tell people that it took me 8 years to graduate middle school, but I finally did it, and now I'm working in the high school ranks once again, which I'm very excited to do. But our journey through personalized learning really started with the first year of my career. I started teaching in Palm Beach County, Florida. The governor of that time, pretty good guy. I think you probably know who it is, Governor Bush. He was doing some really good things around accountability systems and making some shifts to increase the rigor in the classrooms. I took those lessons learned to Henry County, Georgia. And one of the biggest lessons learned that I took was the need and the focus of specific and immediate feedback. We need to be in a business of talking to kids. We have done school to kids for a long time. Right now we're in a place where we're doing school for kids, which is a great place to be, certainly admirable, but we need to move in a place where we're doing school with kids and allowing them to be the drivers of some of this work at the same time. So about 5 years ago, we started to think real intently about how to make those shifts in education and what that looks like on the ground and in the classroom. So as Mr. Shelton mentioned, the first jumping off point for Locust Grove Middle School was a blended learning environment. That was because of the county guardrails that were set and how we kind of defined personalized learning back in those times 5 years ago. So the 5 tenets that we consider to be personalized learning tenets fall under a learner profile, which is a online system that allows our students to take surveys that are career-based, interest-based. It's a chance for us to get to know our students on a deeper and more meaningful level, but also a place where they can upload mastery content. So as soon as they master and show evidence of content in their courses, they can upload that in the learner profile and hopefully use it as they gain industry certification and other degrees as a entry point into college and potentially a portfolio for career in the future. Another tenet that we have is the thought of 21st century skills being embedded in everything that we do. Employers are asking that we graduate students with the ability to collaborate, communicate, and critically think through different problems and solutions. And unfortunately, a lot of our classes don't allow students to do that. We still work in environments many times where the students are used to consuming education. We need them to step out and start creating that education. So the thought of 21st century skills and embedding those tools in what we do is very important. We also look at authentic learning opportunities for our students. So project-based, inquiry-based type of skills, things to get the kids hands-on with what they're doing and how they're learning is really essential in this work. And then we also have the use and resource of technology, which is kind of our first step into what we were doing, was to use and leverage the tool of technology in a different way, moving past the YouTube videos or the TED Talks or even some of the Kahoot games. Those educators in the audience know what I'm talking about. But really using this as a tool and really a resource to restructure how we go about school and what time looks like in school. Which brings me to the last tenet, which is competency-based education, which has been a really powerful shift because now we are honoring the fact and knowledge that learning can happen any place, anytime, anywhere. And we have to know what a student is bringing to the table when they get to the classroom so that we can not only offer credit, opportunity for that knowledge, but also be able to take them from where they are to where they need to be. So within those guardrails that have been set out by Henry County Schools, each school has their own autonomy. We have 51 schools in the county. We all have our own individual autonomy to do what we need to do that's in the best interest of our communities, which is really powerful, and certainly one of the more important things that I think our county allows us. But that is the story and structure of kind of our walk through this personalized learning journey. It's been a difficult one, there's no doubt, but it has been extremely rewarding, and I'm extremely passionate about where we've gone and certainly where we're going.
Thanks very much, Tony. First, please call me Jim. I'm feeling old enough already. So just a couple of quick clarifying questions, and then we'll have Angie go. You talked about a couple of things that I think are pretty important. One, that the competency base, a lot of people tend to think about that as a way to allow kids to move at their own pace. You talked about it as also a mechanism for giving students flexibility about the ways in which they learn something and where they may happen to learn it as well. So can you just talk about that just a little bit, because I think it's different than oftentimes people think about.
Sure. So first of all, competency-based education does allow for that flexibility, but when we start to think about, and just to give you an example, I was talking to my table mates earlier this morning about it, we have a time period in the day that's called instructional focus, and until I got to the high school, it was really not utilized very effectively, but what I've done this year is change that to include a passion project. So our kids right now are working through career-related passion projects that they are interested in and passionate about. And one example of that is we have a kid who is an agri-science student. He's chosen that as his career pathway. And he just 2 days ago took it upon himself, because of his passion project, to call upon some experts in the field of aquaponics, bring them to Henry County, and bring together a panel of experts from our local system and board to advocate for a new greenhouse that would revolutionize, really, the agri-science program at our school. This was completely done by the student. He brought in his interest, his passion, and then what I've asked him to do, and others like him, is to go out and search those competencies themselves to determine where exactly what they're doing and what they're learning right now in their passion project can also relate to the contents that they're going through. So we have another group of students that's building cars out of PVC pipes and bicycle innards. There's a lot of competencies that are fulfilled in the subjects of English, in the subjects of physics, math. So what I've asked our students to do is to take the driver's seat. I think one issue that we've had in the past with project-based learning is it's been teacher-driven, and that's really tough to do. That's a really heavy lift for a teacher to try to find interdisciplinary projects for the kids to be involved in. But what I'm having our kids do is they're driving this process. They're the ones determining what competencies they're fulfilling and showing mastery of. And then they're taking those things and defending those to their content teachers. So it's really putting the kid more at the driver's seat than we've ever done in the past. That's been a huge shift for our kids. It's been a huge shift for our teachers and our parents alike. But for those kids that have really, and again, I'm only in my infancy now of a high school principal, but in the first few months, I have several examples of our kids really doing some amazing things with education.
Fantastic. Let me push on just one other thing. You talked about the agency piece. I think that's pretty incredible. But you've also talked about this 21st century skills thing. And you also talked about a set of skills that your student demonstrated in terms of initiative and probably responsibility, self-direction, a bunch of other things as well. Many of those things don't show up in the accountability frameworks. There's not really clear assessments for them. How are you thinking about that, and are there policy things that are getting in the way there that can enable that work to happen more efficiently?
That is a great question, something that we have continued to struggle with over time. So yeah, when you look at a report card, it is broken down by content, and the kids and the parents look at and monitor their progress over time in that class, but it doesn't really speak to those 21st century skills that I mentioned before. So we have borrowed and stolen some of the work that's out there from the habits of work protocols and rubrics. And we have leveraged those items to use as assessment tools for those 21st century skills. So those things speak directly to kids showing up to class on time and being prepared, but also their ability to present, collaborate, communicate, and critically think through different issues as they are learning and fulfilling the competencies through what they're asked to do.
Awesome.
So that does not show up on the report card, but our plan and the discussion that we've had with our local and state is to allow for that to show up kind of like we used to, what was it called, what was that other category you had? You had the grade, and then you had the behavior, effort, whatever. That category now being like a habits of work category. So it would still show up as an assessment grade, but not really be calculated into the GPA itself.
Awesome. We'll come back to more. Let me introduce now Angie Stallings, who is the Associate Superintendent of Policy and Communications from Utah. Hopefully that is right.
Deputy, but associate's close enough.
Okay. I'll just stop looking at these. Okay. But the most important thing is that you actually have led a lot of the work that has launched the pilot programs in the state and created the policy context for it. I understand that there's members of your team are here who actually are leading that work for you, but the most important thing is when you have the opportunity to share what you've learned along the way.
Absolutely. Thank you, Jim. I really
Sure.
appreciate it. And if I had known I was going to be the hair member of the panel, I would have maybe focused on my hair a little more than I did. But
Any hair day is a good day.
yeah, that's right. And apparently I'm also the only member of the panel with PowerPoints. Hopefully it won't be death by PowerPoints for you. But I think as the state representative on the panel, a lot of my role and a lot of what I'm going to be telling as far as Utah's story does come from the policy perspective and what we have in code, as well as our board rule and policies. And so the PowerPoint not only serves as something for me to refer to as I'm moving forward, but also hopefully as a resource to you all after this session. If you want to access any of the samples of legislation or board rule, there are actually some slides that I won't be showing today that Sarah and I have included in the PowerPoint that you can access later. And so if you want to take a look at some of our board rules, the State Board of Education, that's who I work for, and I am assisting them in implementing what the legislature hands off to us and clarifying some of those things in board rules. So as I said, Angie Stallings, I'm the Deputy Superintendent of Policy and Communication, and formerly, before I joined the State Board of Education, I actually worked for 10 years for the Utah State Legislature, drafting initially tax bills, and then the majority of my time with the legislature drafting education bills, both K-12 and higher ed. And so when we look at this timeline that we stole from the ExcelinEd report on pathway to personalized learning, at times in this timeline, I was with the legislature, and then I've moved to the State Board of Education, and later on, I will talk about the lessons we've learned as we've, along with our legislative partners, State Board, and our LEAs, our school districts and charter schools, why you might see more of a flurry of activity happening now, even though I think there's been a desire for many years, especially from the legislature, but even at the board and the LEA level, to really get into competency-based and personalized learning since the 90s. And we had statute, legislation enacted as early as 1994, early 2000, and then the most recent was in 2013, where the legislature asked the board to essentially come up with a program. And unfortunately, I don't think at that time the board had the resources and the capacity and the time to focus on really developing that program. So you'll see that in 2016, SB 143 was passed. Senator Howard Stevenson, who unfortunately is not able to be with us today, but I did check in with him yesterday and told him I'd be giving him a shout out. He was the sponsor of SB 143 in 2016, and we have the House sponsor here with us, Representative Kim Coleman, so I can give a shout out to her in person. But they passed this legislation that came after, actually, we had a joint legislative conference that included legislators, state board members, school districts and charters, and included our higher ed partners, including UCAT, which is our career and technical colleges, and our traditional higher ed universities and colleges. The conference really got people excited and talking about competency-based education, and it allowed people to get together in groups and start brainstorming what this was going to look like depending on the role they were in, whether they were a legislator, whether they were a principal or superintendent. And so that got everybody excited, and then shortly after that conference, SB 143 was passed. And I do have to give a shout out to ExcelinEd. Without ExcelinEd, we would not be where we are at today in Utah. Not only, I think, from the legislative perspective, I know they've given the legislature a lot of support in drafting and supporting bills like SB 143, but now that we're at the implementation stage and we as the board are providing technical assistance and support to our pilot LEAs who are getting ready to really move in this direction, ExcelinEd, KnowledgeWorks, EdElements have really been fantastic partners for Utah. Because of the limited resources we have, we don't have the dollars to go out and contract with, many people, but we feel like we have the best partners, and we just are just grateful. So thank you, ExcelinEd. Thank you, Carla, who's been with us from the very beginning, starting with the conference that she and Tom Vander Ark helped back in 2015, I believe is when it was. And so SB 143, essentially, the main parts that I want to focus on, it established those competency-based core principles in statute. It provided or required the state board to establish an advisory committee of experts to then flesh out or come up with the framework that meets those principles. And then, and we're kind of in that stage right now where the advisory committee has been formed. We also hired a fantastic, well, actually she was already with us at the state board, but her role changed, and I almost felt like I should put on the timeline the date that Sarah Young became coordinator of competency-based education at the State Board of Education, because once that happened, we started to see the focus and the capacity, and she's the type of person that doesn't say, well, I don't have the resources or I don't have the time. She makes the time and she makes things happen on limited resources. So Sarah's here in the front. Have to give a huge shout out to her. But now Sarah, the next part that the bill required is for the state board to provide technical assistance. And to prepare, we have 13 pilot LEAs who have not been awarded grants yet, but they are in the stage of participating in our Gear Up boot camp type program, and I probably should move forward because a lot of what happens in SB 143 I'll be describing later. Sarah's the type of person, and she says, if we have this impossible feat of going to Mars, everybody's going to be freaking out about all of the scary obstacles, and we can't do that because of this or that. But she's the type of person who says, let's look at the end goal and not focus on the disruptions or the obstacles, and let's move forward. So the first step in our technical assistance that we provided as the board to these 13 pilot LEAs is we started to we surveyed the full community actually before selecting the 13 pilot LEAs, 7 of whom are school districts, 6 are charters. And we started to find out who was interested. And the majority of our school districts and charter schools are interested in competency-based education. And they raised some very interesting questions that you'll see there that oftentimes highlight some state barriers, but more often perceived barriers of why maybe competency-based education can't or won't work in their state. And so this was informative for us to see what it was, what kind of questions they've had as we prepared technical assistance, as we've worked on policies to be able to address the questions they have. And then now we are in the exploratory pilot phase. We've had these Gear Up boot camps, and ExcelinEd, KnowledgeWorks, Ed Elements, and others have been supporting us in that. And once we get through this stage of the advisory committee establishing the framework and the LEAs, the school districts and charter school teams, working out what CBE looks like for them at the local level, we're hoping to have a framework in board rule, in guidance, that then other LEAs can start using to scale this up statewide. After we do this exploratory pilot, like I said, we're in phase 1 right now, the legislation calls for us to select 3 of those 13 to receive planning grants. And then after that year, if we see that their plan is something that actually we believe will work, they've got the budget for it, they have the leadership in place at the principal, the district level, then they can receive an implementation grant. After a year of implementation money, they can then receive an expansion grant with the idea that maybe they're implementing these programs either at a school or a program in the school level, that then they can take that to their full district, to their full school. So hopefully that helps you see the timeline of where we're going. And I think one of the biggest keys to the program and how we're rolling this out in Utah is we don't have all the answers at the State Board of Education. I wish we did. I wish we could say if you do A, B, C, and D, you will be successful in your school district or in your charter school. But because every school is so different, because the stakeholders are different, the principals and where they're at are so different, what we are doing is everybody's coming together, our 13 pilot LEAs, the state board, we've got legislators, we've got board members, and we have our partners like ExcelinEd who are helping us figure out together what that framework looks like.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So there's a ton of questions I have, but I actually want to let Matt go ahead and present some of the things that are happening on the national policy stage. And so Matt, I'm not from KnowledgeWorks, and you can tell everybody what your title actually is.
Yeah.
And we'll go from there. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Jim. Yeah, I'm the Vice President of Policy and Advocacy for KnowledgeWorks. And really honored to be here, to be on this panel, and I'm literally staring at people that are doing this work. So that is a little intimidating. So as I think to talk, one of the things I was asked to talk about is kind of trends nationally. What are we seeing at a state level? What are we seeing at kind of that federal, national level as it relates to personalized competency-based learning? And I think one of the things is we look at states and how they are really embracing this and moving this forward, as well as districts in their states, in those states rather, pushing them. You've got to ask the question, why? So why are we seeing an uptick in the focus on personalized competency-based education? I think Governor Bush laid out a lot of that. You're looking at achievement gaps, both racial, ethnic achievement gaps. You're looking at international achievement gaps. You're looking at global as well as regional competitiveness. You're looking at an uncertain, complex, and ambiguous world that we need to prepare our students for. And the fact that the future isn't in the future is now. It's just unevenly distributed, which opens up another piece of the puzzle, which is the equity question, and all the kind of the layers of the onion of the equity question as you begin to pull those out and push those out. So states are really looking at, particularly those that are taking kind of visionary leadership around this issue of personalized competency-based learning, are really looking at this as an opportunity to really begin to invest in the shifting of the system, the entire system. So what are the trends that we're seeing? Well, for context's sake, in 2012, about half of the states had policies focused on personalized learning. In 2017, nearly all states have policies on the books or regulations that are focused on personalized learning. Moreover, half of the states have invested in innovation funds, innovation initiatives, and/or competency-based, personalized learning-based pilots. So we've seen a significant uptick in that. And again, some of the reasons, and there are state chiefs in the room right now that can tell you part of this is about equity, most assuredly, plus global competitiveness. The fact that readiness, college and career readiness, is not a static metric anymore. That is a dynamic function because of the world we live in. So The other thing that we're seeing, that's the state policy front. We're seeing some activity on that front. But the other piece that's tied to this is the Every Student Succeeds Act. I think many people, certainly in our organization, we saw in December 2015, when that bill was passed, that this could be a moonshot for personalized learning. And we put out paper after paper after paper after paper on it, which you can find at knowledgeworks.org. But those papers focused on the opportunities, and there were opportunities within accountability, certainly in indicators, the weighting, the creation of new indicators, the growth and proficiency piece. There were opportunities in assessment around multiple interim assessments, potentially rolling up into a final summit of adaptive testing, performance tasks. Section 1204 of the law, which is the innovative assessment pilot, provides an opportunity for states to begin to shift the entire system of assessment. Areas in the educator workforce to focus on state credentialing and professional development, teacher evaluation, and then the expanded learning opportunity, kind of the all students area of 21st Century Learning Centers, really looking at those, block grants, as well as obviously the whole Title IV world that exists in that section of the law. So that was kind of the opportunity that was there to reshape the system. And I think what states really did, and I think in the end this was smarter than a moonshot, was really looking at providing a pathway forward with kind of mile markers, if you will, to move states forward. So that's what we kind of saw, was the notion of multiple pathways. And so we saw states really investing in looking at multiple graduation pathways, as well as multiple pathways to allow students to explore STEM or STEAM or any of the kind of permeations that exist within that. We saw a lot of investment in micro-credentialing, particularly for teachers, as well as students to some degree, but certainly for teachers. Invested in kind of increasing the local flexibility, which again provides that environment that we feel is best to allow personalized learning, competency-based learning really to grow. We saw a lot of kind of personalized supports for students in these transition spaces. So thinking about kind of the pre-K into elementary, as well as the elementary, middle, and the middle high, and then the college transition. So really looking at those areas that if we ever had a pipeline are kind of the leaky parts of the pipeline. Leveraging technology, and this is where I will say that technology is a tool. It is not the be-all, end-all of personalized learning. The development of socio-emotional learning, 21st century skills, whatever you want to call those skills, that if people don't have, they don't get hired, and they certainly get fired. And then I think the biggest emphasis that I saw in ESSA is really around one of the bigger questions as it relates to personalized and competency-based learning, and that is human capital. So personalized PD, self-paced PD, online, training in 21st century teaching and learning, aligning those kind of both pre-service and in-service programs, multiple pathways for teachers just as much as for students, and really taking the ideas that undergird personalized and even competency-based learning and putting those in place for teachers as well. So those are kind of some of the trends that we're seeing as it relates to both the state and then as it relates to states reacting to federal law with regards to ESSA.
Thank you. So what I want to do is actually, because I heard a lot of themes emerge in your words just now, and what Tony laid out as the framework at the very beginning, that he found as his 4 or 5 core elements, including everyone has brought up the technology as a tool, but frankly it is a tool and it kind of is either there or not when you need it. Fantastic. Let's spend our time on the other stuff. There were 3 things that emerged, and I wanted to just really nail right now. The need for different ways of thinking about assessment. You talked about it. It was in the legislation that was one of the things that's supposed to happen. And I'm going to go from the assessment to specifically in the legislation. It also called for meeting the specific learning needs of individual students. I've not seen a ton of progress on that front. I'm really curious where you are and you're thinking, what you're seeing, putting in school in terms of what you're doing to kind of fill in the gaps. You talked about one, but I'd love to hear some more. And then I'd love for you to talk about what states are doing to actually try and move into the future. Go ahead, Tony.
So yeah, assessment's always a huge deal, especially when you are a teacher in a classroom, and how you are defined as a good teacher comes back to a state assessment. That is very difficult, and one of the barriers that we certainly have to work through and work across. So the way we are trying to change that narrative is to make sure we are pushing the performance-based model more than we are the state standardized testing model. How we define and how we look at success in the classroom and for an individual kid, that discussion needs to be made, and we need to find a new definition of what a kid can do and how we best measure what that looks like. So again, within those...
Can I just push you for a second?
Sure.
Recognizing that the accountability system is tied to the state assessment, how do you create a context where the teachers want to pay attention to these performance assessments that you're asking about, recognizing that that's hanging over all of your heads?
One thing that I've done at the high school level is push the kids to do that work, and that's been an impetus for change for us this year, because for teachers and parents alike, it's very difficult to work through that paradigm shift. Kids honestly do a much better job than we do as adults making those changes. But I think we have to look back at the data from schools, counties, and states that are currently working and doing this work right now. At the current high school I'm at, I use the data from our middle school. So we made those changes and shifts. We focused less on state assessments, more on competencies. And we saw 2 years ago, we saw our CCRPI scores grow 13.6 points, which was the most in the county, and I think it landed us top 10% in the state of Georgia, which was significant. The thought and the theory is that if you take care of students and you build a learning environment that speaks to them at a deeper level, that the state assessments are going to take care of themselves.
Fantastic.
And don't get me wrong, I think the accountability systems have to be there. There needs to be some type of assessment tool, but I don't know that state assessments are the one factor that we should look at and define and label a kid and a teacher in a classroom on whether they're successful or not. We've got to look outside the scope of, again, how are we truly assessing what a kid can do or not do in a classroom.
Fantastic.
This last year, we had a big revamp to our assessment and accountability system, which hasn't been implemented yet or hasn't taken effect. It will for this 17-18 school year this spring. But assessment and accountability is always a huge topic in Utah. And unfortunately and fortunately, because we've been learning things year by year, we've had to amend our accountability system almost annually, which is unfortunate. However, I would argue that because we have been updating the accountability system, it has gotten better every time. This last session related to your what you were talking about earlier about focusing on CTE and college courses, our grading system for the first time, our accountability system this year, 17-18, will include the completion rates of students in concurrent enrollment, which is dual enrollment or enrollment in our higher ed courses. It includes performance on courses like AP, IB, as well as other upper level or post-secondary type credit gaining courses. It also includes how well the schools are doing at getting their students into CTE pathways and being completers in those pathways. And so I think districts and charters are excited because it's going to showcase the work they're doing. It's not just the performance on SAGE, which is our end-of-level assessment. It's graduation rate, it's student performance on ACT, it's student participation in those concurrent enrollment, IB, AP, et cetera. Now, the one perceived barrier I think people have, and it may or may not happen in Utah, I think they do have it though, is that competency-based or personalized learning doesn't work with our assessment system because they think they have to wait till the end of the year for those students to take the course, or that the student has to take a course tied to their grade versus the content. That's not the case in Utah. The assessment your students will be taking are the assessments that are tied to the course that they're enrolled in. And also our windows are open at different times during the year so that as students are finishing those courses, they can come in and take those assessments in a timely way. I think often what happens is LEAs, school district charters, don't know about that flexibility or they don't know what they can do. But.
Really appreciate it. And so that's how you're solving the timing issues associated with the current assessment systems. I suppose there's also content issues, like when you start letting students take it at a different timings, then figuring out how you come up with enough items and things like that turns out to be an issue. Matt, can you talk a little bit more about how others are thinking about the assessment issue and solving some of these really practical problems that they're encountering?
Sure, yeah. I mean, I think assessment presents both challenges in a short-term as well as a long-term kind of look at this work. I think one thing quickly tied to the ESSA comments I made, I think the area of ESSA where we saw the least amount of kind of innovation was in the assessment area. And I think that's for several reasons. One, I think it's states investing in pilots and investing in the districts that are kind of leading that work in a networked fashion in their states so they can learn from them to understand how to migrate the assessment system. And that's both the summative portion, which we focus on an awful lot as we talk about assessment. The other thing tied to that is the development or the need to develop, certainly at a local level as well as on a more scaled level, is the formative interim assessment pieces that need to be developed to support personalized and competency-based learning. And this exists both on the content side as well as in the areas that are focused more on kind of skill acquisition, skill development as well, which are those assessments are really very much of their infancy at this point. But I think the point that Angela made that I want to pick up on is this notion of calibration. So investing in pilots, many states are doing this, as I said, really looking at the data of those lead adopters and understanding what they're doing, what they need in that space, so that they can begin to calibrate the assessment policies in that state. And this is kind of, we've seen a lot of states do this. One state I'll kind of give a shout out to is North Dakota. They've passed a pilot bill. They're in the midst of implementing that with both the administrative rules and an application process. And the thought there from the state chief, Kirsten Basler, is that over time they'll begin to calibrate and begin to move. And I think you're seeing markers in other ESSA plans as well. And I think the short-term piece can be solved by these kind of test when ready, open windows, multiple windows, during a cycle of a year to allow students to test when they are ready. That allows a little more flexibility outside those kind of that grade level, more like a grade span, if you will.
Good deal. So let me just tie a couple quick things together. So this notion that once we go to a more competency-based systems, we need different mechanisms for being flexible about how we let people demonstrate that they know something. But there still needs to be a mechanism for ensuring that actually that's a valid demonstration of that competence, or else we have a race to the bottom. So what I hear is that one of the strategies that you're pursuing and other states are pursuing is pilots as a way to do that, to begin to use the data to understand what this actually means, and then to recognizing that you don't have all the answers, to let the field help you solve some of these problems. Can we talk a little bit about what's happening around the pilot, some of the lessons learned about doing pilots well, and specifically in Utah, what you wish you had done differently now having the opportunity to look in retrospect?
Thanks. Well, I think that a lot of what we are doing now is because of those lessons learned from the early legislation, the early efforts at the State Board of Education. And I think we truly are. I wish I could highlight all of the amazing work that is happening at each of the LEA levels. Sarah would be much more familiar with that, but I know that based on their feedback, we are adjusting at the state level our policies. We've got flexibility that I think school districts and charters aren't aware of. Our pilots are becoming aware of. Some of that flexibility, for example, I'm sure much like many of your states, your funding is based on some sort of a seat time model. Ours is the 180 days with 990 instructional hours. All of our funding models that come from the legislature, including all of our systems for reporting to the state board and our distribution methods, are based on this 180-day standard. What we did do back in 2015, 2016, I'm trying to remember exactly when the board adopted it, but we amended our funding rule, administrative rule, to allow districts and charters or even programs for groups of students to establish a continuing enrollment measurement that is different than if a student misses 10 days of school, you drop them, you no longer receive funding for them. So the LEAs now have an ability to adopt a policy that, let's say that you've got, and we see this not just in charters, but in districts that have smaller, programs where they have online competency-based students, and really trying to come up with a policy that says, well, they have, a certain amount of time to demonstrate a project or provide evidence of the competencies, or maybe it's a interaction with the teacher every 5 days or minimum logins. But we're allowing districts to do that. Also, we have a board rule that allows LEAs to seek waivers from board rule, and we don't have many who have taken advantage of that. We've got about five in place right now. We've got 4 coming up next week. Actually, the State Board of Education will be considering waivers from our early college high schools. These are generally charter schools that are either located on the campus of a university or they have very strong relationships with universities, and they're actually seeking some waivers from our graduation requirements in PE or art, for example, so those students can take more concurrent enrollment courses or STEM courses. And again, also seat time. We have a lot of schools that want some flexibility in not having a full 180-day. They may want to have less. That's been more common, is to get some exceptions from those. So we do have policies in place, and I just don't, flexibility that's there, I just don't think the districts and charters are aware of how much flexibility they could take advantage of or how to do it.
Matt, you want to add anything?
I would just add that to me, there's emerging kind of 5 lessons around pilots. That we've learned from other states as they've implemented. I think number 1 is be strategic, which seems obvious, but understand what you are trying to accomplish with the pilot. What's your goal with that? Is it just to be part of the cool kid crowd? Not the right answer. Or is it really aligned to something you want to do from a strategic plan standpoint within a state? I think number 2, understand the why. Really look at developing, certainly at a local level, but I think at a state level, South Carolina has done this amongst others, create a profile of a graduate. What do we want to see as a graduate coming out of our schools in our state? And make sure that's aligned to the pilot that you're implementing. I think number 3 is get broad-based support. I think we've seen this in North Dakota and other states. In North Dakota, they got the Chamber of Commerce and North Dakota United, the teachers union, on board early to where they were pushing with the department and the governor and many others to get that bill through. And that also leads to state-level sustainability. Number 4, rather, is local context is king. Allow for planning time. That's also going to allow for sustainability of the work at the local level, which then is coupled with the sustainability at the state level. And then lastly, and I mentioned this before, and this is, I guess, my dead horse of the day, is policy supports and calibration of those. Kind of a continual calibration and a continuum of how you're intervening on the policy level.
Go ahead, Tony.
Could I also mention on the other side of that pilot program, so I was one of those people, and Matt, excuse me, but I always wanted to sit at that cool kid table, so that may have been part of the reason I went into it to begin with. But the other side of that, from the school level perspective, the pilot program and that rollout forces us as school leaders and communities to think intently about that why. And the why is the biggest question that we have to answer. If we don't move forward with a consistent and clearly communicated why about what we're doing, then our efforts will fail. I was given a lot of pushback from our community, from the parents, from the students, from even the teachers. And if I had not established that why and been asked by my county several times to talk through that and even seek feedback from them, I don't think we would be in the place that we are today. So that is one huge, in terms of just the pilot program initiatives, that's one huge benefit of having a school go through it. It was uncomfortable. It wasn't a lot of fun because my ideas and plans and thoughts were dissected, and I was giving critical feedback on all that stuff. But that's what learning's about in the classroom as well. Going back to my earlier statement about providing feedback to kids, I needed that same feedback. So going through that pilot program process was really powerful.
Tony, just say a little bit more. What was the why that you gave your community?
That's a great question, and it really comes down to the fact that when I was at the middle school, I would hand over every year a group of 8th grade students to the high school and tell them they are ready, they are prepared, they are excited, here they are. And then 5 years ago, I sat back and watched our high school principal at the time celebrate a graduation growth from 72% graduation rate to 76%. That 4% growth was terrific. But I sat back and I thought, wow, that means 1 out of every 4 kids that we have are not graduating in 4 years. And that's not good enough. Our kids deserve better. So that was the beginning of our why. It was based solely on the fact that I believed in our students and believed in our community, and I believed that we could do better than what we were doing for our kids. So that was the beginning of our why. And I think it's a pretty strong one. Right now, we are celebrating a graduation rate upwards of right at 89%. So we've continued to increase that, and I certainly look to the work that we've done in personalizing learning.
Yes.
Thank you. Yeah. Certainly look at the work that we've done in personalized learning as being one of the answers to that. But again, a lot of times it's us as educators stepping out of the way of kids and giving them that autonomy and agency to do the work themselves. That's really made the biggest difference. So that's our why.
Fantastic. And I'm going to stay with you just one more second. You talked about the notion, and it's come up throughout the conversation about whether it's career themes or other themes, and letting students have choice about where they actually want to spend their time and how they want to spend their time. You talked about the Passion Project in particular. You also talked about, and as a mechanism for motivation, you also talked about shifting the work and the burden from teachers to students. So I want to pull these two things together. Asking every teacher to figure out how to personalize for each student is a level of cognitive load that is almost impossible. So talk about some of the other structures that need to be in place to shift burden from teachers, and then specifically talk about how you thought about getting students set on fire so that they are willing to take that burden.
How much time do we have?
We got a minute.
Okay, great. That's more than enough
You can
time.
go for 2.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a loaded question because there's so much that goes into that. First and foremost, it comes down to us as educators defining what that mastery level learning looks like. And I think once we define that through the competencies, through performance indicators, and then communicate those things through learning targets to our students that are written in kid-friendly I can statement form, now we can communicate those learning expectations to our kids and start having those discussions. But it is something that from an educator standpoint, we've got to plan and prepare for prior to even getting to that point. So the planning stages of what teachers do for a classroom environment has changed dramatically. No longer are we planning a single lesson for Monday and then going to the lesson on Tuesday and then Wednesday. Now we are planning for a full unit well ahead of time so that all the resources, the activities, the assessments, everything that a kid needs is already there, communicated to the kid, and the kid can, after taking a diagnostic assessment, be placed in exactly where they need to be within that content. Now that's what's happening like in the classroom environment. So our classrooms look differently. Yes, there are times and certainly needed to be times where we have whole class direct instruction, but at the same time, what we need our kids to do is get actively engaged in the content as well. So when you walk into classrooms at our school, you're going to see kids working and working where they are plugged into the competency, not because we're all 13 years old and it's the 101st day of school and this is my laminated lesson plan that I've had for years. But instead, this is where I am as a student, this is what my assessments tell me, and this is where I know I need to go. But then there's also that other piece, like I mentioned before, within our passion projects, where the kid becomes the driver of what's going on, and we not only have to communicate the learning target and that I can statement for the kid, but allow them to be exposed to the competency so that they start to look at, okay, if I'm expected to know this and be able to show examples of this, then what can I do with what I'm passionate about to show my teacher, my principal, that I can handle that and show mastery of that. And that's where we're really transforming from a teacher-led environment more to a student-created environment.
Okay, and last question on it. Is there any set of policies in particular that either enable or allow you to do that, or is that something that, frankly, you can just do and then just let everything take care of itself?
Well, and that's another great question. So the state of Georgia, Governor Deal, and I know there's a lot of state officials from Georgia in the room right now, and I appreciate the fact that they have asked the right questions and they've created the right flexibilities. But raise your hand if you are a state official right now. So I have a few in the room, not too many, so there won't be too many tomatoes thrown at me. The biggest thing when it comes to a barrier in the flexibilities, because they are there are flexibilities there, but the biggest barrier that we have is that for a teacher, you are still defined by that state assessment. So we've, in the state of Georgia, given incentives for innovation. We provide the flexibilities, the seat time waivers, the class size waivers. We've even gone to a system where our end of course tests are given monthly so that our kids can take it when they are ready, which is powerful, really powerful. But for a teacher, it's still really difficult to move past the fact that I'm being judged based on a state test, a state assessment. And that's the one barrier that we see. Just 2 weeks ago, just before Thanksgiving break, I was speaking to a teacher that came with me from the middle school, is now at the high school. She's an English teacher. She's teaching right now English 1 and English 2.
Let me pause you before
Yeah.
you finish the story. I'm going to ask you if you have questions to begin the form at the mics, so I can go to the audience. Now, go ahead. Sorry.
Thank you. So just real quick, she spoke about the fact that her 10th grade class, which does not end in an end-of-course test, actually a few students from the classroom came to thank her about, and because she's making the English fun again. There's some fun and excitement in the English classroom. So I looked at her and I said, well, Nikki, why didn't this happen in your 9th grade class? And her answer was, well, there's a lot of content I got to get through because we have an EOC at the end of that classroom. Now, looking at both of those classrooms, because I've walked in since that time, I can tell you with no reservation that there's more learning happening in that 10th grade classroom than the 9th grade classroom right now. But she feels restricted because of that test that comes up at the end. So yeah, the flexibilities are there, the incentives are there for innovation, but we again have to find a different way to judge not only the teachers but the students themselves in the system of competencies.
Awesome. So, Giselle, I know you have a question, and we'll go ahead.
Yes. What I feel is that there's a huge tension between the assessment piece and the feeling of parents and legislators that children have to be assessed along certain lines, and this competency-based personalized learning piece, which really doesn't fit in with the old paradigm. It's a different thing altogether. Right. Do you see any hope or any movement to change the way we think about the curriculum at all? I mean, we are using a curriculum that was created in 1893 by the Committee of 10. Because that tension is almost impossible to resolve.
Go ahead and answer.
I have a really great story that I heard this week about how curriculum and instructional practices are changing with some of these pilots, some of the schools that are in Competency Base, and how that's actually impacting higher ed. For example, I just heard about Logan Innovations High. Some of you may already be aware of Salt Lake Innovations High as well. We have 3 Innovations Highs in Utah, and this most recent one that just opened up this fall was partnering with Utah State University as well as their local UCAP partner, Bridgerland. And they were talking about what's going to happen when these students move into higher ed. And Utah State said, we have to change the way we're providing instruction at Utah State University because of how Innovations High is going to be providing instruction. And it's exciting to see how the momentum is being built, not just among LEAs, but it's actually moving from K-12 to higher ed. And isn't that refreshing to hear? So.
Fantastic. Sir.
Yeah, my question is a variation on the higher ed piece. Are you all aware of any work being done successfully by any higher ed program to actually train teachers and principal leaders in what it takes to be able to deliver personalized learning in the schools rather than retraining graduates from the schools of education to do what they didn't get in the School of Higher Ed?
Before we answer, sir, will you just introduce yourself and then all the rest of the questions, will you do that before you start? Thanks.
My name is Hugh Blackwell. I'm a member of the North Carolina House.
Thank you, sir. Anybody want to take that?
Yeah, I can take that. We're starting to see that. I mean, I think you're absolutely right. You've identified kind of the undergirding issue around human capital is we cannot continue to retrain teachers. We need to begin to get at the root of it with pre-service. And so areas of the country or states, rather, that have invested in either A, pilots, or B, kind of a statewide approach to competency or personalized learning, we're starting to see those kind of the alignment and articulation beginning to happen. So in Maine and in New Hampshire, and I know that many of the states that are launching programs right now on the onset are involving higher ed, both from an alignment standpoint around kind of the curricular alignments, the testing alignments, entrance requirements, et cetera, but also around pre-service. So I know South Carolina's having conversations. I think you all are as well. North Dakota and many others are having those conversations on the onset. So we are not seeing full-on shifting yet, but we're beginning to see where the districts and the state are leading. You're starting to see investment in changing the pre-service at the college level in those states.
But I take it there's no higher ed institution that anyone knows who's actually taking the lead as a institution of higher ed and helping us to implement and prepare for this type of learning.
I'm not aware of one at this point.
Sir.
Yes, good morning. Larry Williams. I'm a governmental affairs consultant from Florida. And I think this question is probably directed best to Tony. With personalized learning comes obviously a lot more personalized attention from the educator in the classroom to each individual student. How have your teachers adapted and handled a time management problem with all the personalized learning going on in the classroom?
Twofold. So at the middle school level, where the flexibilities were a little bit easier to manage, I actually created a schedule where there was a rotation that decreased class size. So our class sizes at Locust Grove Middle School there for a time were around 15 to 1, and that is a huge help. It is virtually impossible to differentiate to 32 different kids and to provide personalized learning efforts to each individual student. But for schools that don't have that availability or can't, and I'm at a high school right now where it's very difficult, the way, again, we look at planning and the rollout of that curriculum in the classroom is the most important piece. Again, there's going to be a time where a kid needs that individual attention from a teacher and that specific feedback. But while that is happening, if you know that the rest of your class has taken a diagnostic, they know where they're at, they know where they're going, they know where to go if they need support, then you can start having those conversations with individual kids. And I see my teachers doing that a lot, actually. That's one of the more refreshing things that they've talked about, and one of the things I like most about personalized learning is it's taking them away from the bell schedules, the lunch duties, the lesson planning, and really bringing us back to the heart of why we got into education to begin with, and that is we want to talk to kids, we want to help kids, and that's what they're doing. But again, there's a lot of pre-work that goes into an environment like that working and happening. So we've rolled out a professional development plan this year that includes 3 strands, and our teachers have gotten to self-select what strand they want to go into. The strands are pace, path, and expectations. The PACE group is working intently on competency-based instruction, what that looks like in the classroom. The expectations group is looking at DOK levels, and then the other group is looking at the project-based and inquiry-based piece. So I am, in a sense, personalizing the professional development for our staff by seeing their interests, their entry point, and what they need, and setting my professional developments up much like the expectations we have in the classroom.
Can I just build on that question? Because you also talked about a learner profile. So one of the ways many places are actually addressing this issue is begin to pull together data in a way that lets teachers have a better sense of what's going on with each student and to manage that load again. Talk a little bit about that, but then I would love for our policy folks to talk about how we manage this balance there. People are very concerned for rightful reasons about privacy and security and data with the ability and the need, frankly, to use data to be able to personalize education in the ways we're talking about.
So to answer the first part of the question, a lot of the discussion and work came out of a collaborative effort with healthcare systems around our local area. We actually partnered with a group that was already building a personalized online program for the healthcare industry, and we just talked to them and asked them, hey, can you do that, but do that for education? Because what they were doing is basically, again, a collection of data, a collection of health history for each individual person that goes into a doctor's office. Well, why shouldn't the same thing happen for kids? Not just in the diagnosing of issues and support, but we need to know what our students look like. We need to know what they need from us or where we can push them. And that learner profile is an area and platform that allows us to do that. So we have assessment data, we have survey data, we have interest data, and we have, again, an area for them to upload evidence of work into that as well to create an online portfolio. The program that we use, the learner profile that we use, is driven and run by the kids. The teachers don't set it up. The parents have access to it, so do the teachers. But our kids are the ones that are actually running that program. So it is a tool for them to use.
Awesome.
I'll take the student data privacy question. I don't think it's a coincidence that at the same time that we're introducing technology, competency-based and personalized learning into the classroom, that we have parents and board members and legislators who are concerned with student data. We've seen breaches, et cetera. In 2016, Utah also passed the Student Data Privacy Act, which in addition to FERPA, we've got state, what we sometimes call Utah FERPA, and it requires a much higher bar, higher standard on how we secure data, the disclosures we provide to parents and students about how their data is being used, and it's again finding that balance. I mean, I think everything that we've talked about today is trying to find that balance between what do we collect, how much data are we getting through formative or other types of assessments, so we can inform, so our teachers do know where those students are, versus how do we keep that data protected. Our Utah FERPA, our Student Data Privacy Act, which passed, we were lucky enough to get resources of close to $1 million ongoing. We've created a metadata dictionary for our whole state where parents and students can see the data elements that school districts and charters are collecting, as well as the state. We've got a chief privacy officer who is separate from our data people or our assessment people. She actually reports to me, and she acts as kind of a watchdog from our other state employees that are working with data and want the data to make sure that we are putting protections in contracts with our third-party providers, to make sure we're providing training. We just had a great student data privacy conference where we brought in national experts. So yes, student data privacy is very important, and we've got a big focus on it in Utah, and luckily the legislature provided us with the resources. We have 3 FTEs, people at the state board that are focused on training and supporting and providing model policies to our LEAs on how to safeguard student data.
Awesome. Matt, before you go, one of the things I have not seen a lot of states do yet, though I'm seeing some localities do it, is one of the great things besides access that technology provides is, with this data, the ability to accelerate the pace at which we can do research. But that becomes even more a touchy issue as you begin to think about the student data privacy issues. So as you've looked across states, have you seen any examples of folks who've been thoughtful about, as they protect student privacy, how they think about capitalizing on an opportunity to do the kinds of research we never could have done before?
I think we're hoping that Utah can be a good example of
Awesome.
what those privacy, that balance. I know we've been working with Colorado. I'm trying to remember all of the states that there are lots of leaders and elements that you can find in different state statutes. We've been told, and of course maybe they're saying this to me because I'm from Utah, but that Utah's code and rules are some of the most well thought out and developed, and that's because they gave a lot of flexibility to the state board to work through these issues. We have advisory committees who've been informing what our rules look like. So we're really being thoughtful about taking the time to roll that out instead of it all being in the code at the legislative level. We're able to adapt more when you
Awesome.
let the state kind of grapple with those things and amend.
Matt, will you hold your answer while I ask this young lady to ask her a question, and then we can try and do them together?
Thank you. I think it's great to have high school, middle school sort of representation up here, but what does the path to personalized learning or competency education look like in a K-3 model?
I mean, I can speak actually a little bit. You probably can too.
I'm
I mean, I
happy to
think the model I'm most familiar with is actually in Maine. There's a school that does this, and they built out competencies all the way down. So they run pre-K through 12. Now, they don't use grade levels, or they don't say grade. They use levels, which you can say is just semantic. But what I've seen is they really, it's an amazing thing when kids are actually able to articulate the why behind their learning at an early age, particularly in those early grades. I've seen it in action. It's super impressive. And it's undergirded by the same principles you would have at a middle school or a high school, where you have really clear, transparent learning objectives that the students can digest, that they can demonstrate in multiple ways, and it just takes the exact same amount of thought to really build out the competencies, align to the standards, build in the taxonomy so that you have the rigor in place, and then provide multiple ways to assess. But I know Tony can provide a lot more detail than I do.
I just add, we act like this is brand new. Montessori, like 100 years old, was designed with exactly these same principles in mind, based on much of the same science. We just know a lot more and have a lot more capabilities. And so whether it's that or the Piaget method, especially for young people, giving them the opportunity to develop these things very naturally by creating environments where they can have agency and choice at the earliest of ages has been something people have been trying to do for a long time. We just have not figured out how to do it well at scale, and now's another opportunity to go at it. Good deal? Okay, ma'am.
Virginia Irwin, New Hampshire House of Representatives, the Gang of 400. We have been competency-based for about 8 years in New Hampshire. Now most districts, K-12, have competency-based report cards. But you've talked a lot about personalized learning, competency-based education, yet I keep hearing the same lament. Why don't the children graduate in 4 years from high school? Why do you think that's important, and why haven't we changed that?
That's a great question, because as I've seen the transition from middle school to high school, in that we have right now several 8th grade students that are not ready to move on into what we would consider a 9th grade course or classroom, and we have to honor that. We have to make sure that we are again meeting those students where they're at. That does require us to make sure we have a partnership with our middle school, which luckily enough I was just there last year, so we have that. But as the kids are moving from 12th grade on to college, that becomes a different discussion. And again, one of those bigger pieces to that is the restrictions that we have and the ways that we are measured right now. When it still comes down to a graduation rate, when it still comes down to an EOC, and when it still comes down to, let's be honest, an SAT and ACT being one of the first indicators that colleges look at for college admittance, we are still working under that structure. So we have to find creative and innovative ways to make those two worlds collide and work together. And I think that we've made some major strides of doing that, but there's still a long way to go. And again, that's why I think this conference and the discussion that we're having today and into tomorrow is so powerful and really needed.
Can I piggyback on what Tony
Really quickly, because we're at
Yeah,
time.
really quick. I think right now we've got the answer for people who are accelerated and providing incentives for when kids can move quicker and get out quicker. But we haven't answered the question about those students who aren't ready to move on culturally and funding-wise. What happens when we need to retain a student till they're 20 or 21 when state funding only anticipates funding a student till they're 18 or 19? So that's the other question we're grappling with.
And how do you make sure you're not keeping some students on the slow track while you're letting other students go fast?
Right.
Right.
I'm really sorry to the people who had questions that didn't get to answer them, but our panelists are going to hang out for a second up here if you really want their question answered, even if you don't want everybody to hear it, even if everybody else doesn't get to hear it. I want to thank our panelists first and thank all of you for spending the time.